Hi everyone. This is a new session, live session in the standard discussions where I have members from the standard community, amazing engineers, with years and years of experience to talk a little bit about, some of the concepts and the ideas that we like to discuss and eventually kind of extract patterns and tools out of them and finally implement them and incorporating them into our systems. This is also the very first time we go live stream, on multiple networks. So we're going on Twitch, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So it's going to be, really, really fun and amazing. But more importantly, I just want the people like engineers everywhere to know, what it's like to kind of come up with an idea, think about it from scratch, think about all the little details, that surround that particular idea and how does a group of engineers from all over the world come together like that to implement, a capability or a tool, all without having to have, being in person or, coming to 50,000 meetings. Just run an idea and just, put it out there and see how people kind of, take onto it and the concerns. And of course, feel free to kind of drop comments in the comment section. If the stream allows you to drop comments, please go ahead and drop comments and, I will try to respond to it as soon as fast as possible. For those of you who are not familiar with this nice group of people, I have Paul Wardy here from the United Kingdom, and Christo. Both of them are in the UK, and these two gentlemen are like principal level engineers that like to kind of work with some ideas with me and bring these ideas to real life enterprise level applications. So don't expect a typical Hello World program. These are going to be much more in depth kind of discussions. Okay, with that being said, Christo, do you want to kind of high level tell us what we're talking about today, so I just don't do all the talking? Good.
Yeah, so in the previous session, you mentioned SFAL and where we're going to head with that, and we sort of said that that's a long-term big endeavor that we're going to look at, and I think it'll be good if we can set some milestones of the things that we want to achieve, just so we've got a sort of a roadmap to aim at. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just to give people kind of, an introduction to SFAL. SFAL is short for Standardized Framework Abstraction Library. And what this does is that whether you're writing in, JavaScript or Java or C Sharp .NET, whatever framework that you're writing with, you have one way or another, you have a dependency on the framework that supports your applications. Just to kind of give people a high level kind of view here of what we're doing. Let me just open up the draw IO here and explain to people what we're cooking here. So if you look at, any system that you build, there are, some interesting components that comprise what we would consider a system, right? So you have the framework. So this is the framework down here. And then on top of that framework, you have a couple of things. You have your uh, the external components, so external libraries, mock or RESTful sense, whatever external library you like to, kind of work with. But then on top of that, you eventually end up and building your own kind of application, which is your code. So this is a framework code. It's still someone else's code, but it's more targeted and more generic than a particular code that you pull in. This is someone else's code, and then this is here your code right here. Okay, so we talked a little bit in the past about a concept called SPAL, Standardized Provider Abstraction Library, which is basically something generic that kind of sits between you and any particular library. So you don't have hard dependency on Entity Framework or Dapper or whatever library SQLite or whatever is out there that you need to kind of rely on to look into and communicate with. So we talked about SPAL. So SPAL kind of abstract your application from external libraries like this. I'm going to mark these as red. That means it's non-standardized. And SPAL sits right here in the middle here. And it basically says, hey, whoever wants to integrate with this application need to pull in this SPAL framework or contract and allow that framework or contract to work particularly in this particular way. right? So now you're not actually communicating with Entity Framework anymore. You're communicating with something that implements SFAL and works with the Entity Framework underneath. Okay, why is that? Because this is standard compliant system that, there is no surprises there. It follows the same pattern. And since you're building a domain system, you don't have to worry about, oh, I wonder if SQL exception is easier. Like SQL exception is one of these things that is very hard. You can't just create a SQL exception, right? You have to kind of bend the code backwards to generate a SQL exception, right? You shouldn't have to worry about that. You should have a library that's standard compliant, and this standard compliant library allows you, to kind of interact with it to be able to, communicate with a database or communicate with any system, whatever that system may be. We talked about SPAL a little bit, but that's not enough. What we really want to talk about here as well is to abstract this part too. So we want to abstract the framework itself. So something that sits at the bottom here. So this is literally how that view would look like. This guy is like this. External libraries, there's no guarantee it may rely on a SFAL or not. But what we know for certain is that your SFAL libraries really need to rely on a SFAL framework, something that abstracts away the framework, right? Let's put some examples here. External libraries, for instance, like the entity framework. That's an example. The framework underneath that is like .NET Core, whatever that may be. We're building these two components in here, so the system that's working with these two components doesn't have to deal with some of the non-standardized components or models that, are working with this system. Okay? In other words, if your code needs to integrate with something like iQueryable, it's not working with iQueryable anymore. It's working with a type that's standardized, right? That may or may not offer the same capability as an iQueryable. It wraps up iQueryable, push it to the bottom and adds on top of it a layer that allows your system to interact with it. Okay. Feel free to drop comments in the comment section. I see, Ahmed here says on YouTube says, SFAL is like storage. No, no, no. It's an abstraction layer. It's basically something that allows you to interact with core framework components without having to worry whether you can mock them or not, or whether they're standard compliant or not. Can you dependency inject them or not? It really brings into focus the priority of standardizing, of working with only standardized components, especially when it comes to domain systems. Just heads up, this is a little bit of an advanced discussion or advanced topic, so it's going to take a little bit of, wrapping mind around, but eventually once you kind of have your questions answered, I hope it kind of answers these questions. Noter here says, I love your presentation. I appreciate it. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay, Paul or Christo, any comments or concerns here at all? Are we on the same page on this part?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Cool.
think just to add to what you said, really, is that we think of .NET as kind of an abstraction layer on top of the operating system. So what we can think of SFAL as being is essentially an abstraction layer on top of .NET that puts us in a purely standard compliant sort of situation.
Exactly.
At least that's my understanding of it, and I think it kind of gives us that kind of simplified take on it if you think about it that way.
Exactly. Exactly. And that solves a lot of the problems that we have. Like for instance, today we use a library like exception with the X, right, to kind of handle the inability to be able to append, to a list. So I see exception with the X as a pattern that we can include into a SFAL library, like a SFAL based library that basically says, here is this standard compliant exceptions model that you should always be working with moving onwards, right? So, okay, so the question here is, Crystal, we want to take a systematic, a practical approach to kind of propose something like this, right? I want to think about all the ways or all the ideas that we can have to implement something like this. So, like I just said right now, we know that there are existing models like exception, like this, the exception model like this, and this exception model can be, substituted in a SFAL library with exception, which is basically something that has more capability, better way to do this. I know I can also think of off the top of my head, I know that link expressions, like link in general, right? There are things that people keep adding on this on the side. There's a library called more link, and this more link library gives you even more stuff, right? So we would no, seriously, there's things that are very, very interesting. We would replace that with a model like link, for instance, right? So this is, these guys are still pushing away existing framework models, but it's replacing it with something a bit more standardized, a bit more test driven, a bit more practical. So if you look at this realm in here, this realm right here, that's basically your SFAL realm. And this realm in here, that would be your framework or native framework realm. Um, let's just off the top of our head, what are the challenges? What are the biggest challenges? I know that there is grunt effort that needs to go into this to make sure something like this happens. It's not something that you would do in a night, right? It's something that you would want to kind of think long and hard about, to allow people to kind of work always with a SFAL library and not have to call in the framework itself. Also, more importantly, if we do it this way, people should not even have access to the original framework unless we follow what we talked about the other day, which is bring back the original, the native, provider, just like we said yesterday, the native provider. So, challenges, concerns, tell me what you got.
Hmm. Just the sheer volume of work is the obvious kind of start point. I think having clear-cut goals of what you're trying to abstract is kind of key. Just saying .NET isn't really going to get us anywhere. That's a lot of stuff. So it's about kind of prioritizing where you want to begin, I guess.
The prioritization of what we want to start with. And I think
Yeah.
this is a good question because I think that prioritization in here, we could go through, like Paul, we do use the .NET framework, but we only use a handful of things. It's not everything all the time, right? Like I know for a fact that there's only a handful of data types that we work with. There's a handful of routines that we work with. There's a handful of, configurations and external libraries that we work with. These could be the priority, couldn't they?
Yeah. So, Hassan, I think we've got the discussions thread on the standard GitHub community repo. So I think we can start a discussion there, and people can sort of nominate what things they think we can sort of include in our scope for that, and we can sort of vote it up, and then we can get a starting point for that.
Right.
And then I think on top of that, if we identify one thing, we can start a separate repo, do a proof of concept, and everybody can have a bit of a playground in that separate repo, and we can see where we get with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me just navigate real quick and show people where that's at. The standard, I'm going to put the link in here just for people watching. If you look at the standard repository, which is the main standard repository, and if you look at the issues in here, so Cresto, which part? Do we have one at all, or do we start one?
We can start one on the discussions, yeah.
Let's do that. So in here, documentation, SFAL, right? Standardized framework abstraction library. Okay, and in there, just off the top, I'm just gonna put a link for this stream just so people kind of, see what we were talking about. But here's, just in terms of points, first of all, we need to identify the highest priority priority items in an existing framework to abstract away, right? And these higher priority items will be, let me see if I can do a nested list in here. Let's go. It wouldn't let me. I need to do it in a, let's see if I do this. Okay, doesn't matter. I'll do it this way. So what comes to mind is in terms of higher priority items, we are thinking of the following, right? Most commonly used types and also most commonly used routines, right? What's an example of this? Most commonly used types is like string, it's like iQueryable, it's like a list, and so on. Just we need to identify the rest of these, right? And most common routines as well, the things that we usually use, like .toString, for instance, and things like, I don't know, Christo, off the top, what other things that are native routines that we use?
File IO,
What is it?
files and folders, file system IO stuff.
Oh, file stuff. Yeah, that's file
Yeah,
IO, like read, write, from so file IO
yeah,
stuff
or much more specifically, streams, right?
or streams. That's right,
Yeah.
streams. Right, streams like this, right? So there's what else? So that's just routines. Other than types and routines, is there anything else that you can think of?
Things like exception.
That's a type. So that's a type.
Oh, okay.
So there is also something else that you have the .NET framework, but on top of that you have ASP.NET, right? Or you have some other framework. There's, an additional targeted framework for a particular type of application, right? This could also be abstracted, right, at some point in time. This could also have, a certain way of kind of approaching and basically looking at, how we can standardize that, how we can easily mock its components and work with its vulnerabilities and all that. Is there anything else? Is it only just types and routines? There gotta be something else though.
The language itself.
The language.
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends how far you want to go, right?
Yeah.
If we want to like have standardized, if you like, the standard as a thing of its own making kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
you might say that we define our own keywords, for example, if we want to go down that route of like simplifying certain common things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Keywords like for each and if statement test. I think these are okay. We could play around with these, but the language is definitely at some point in time is going to be a part of this. Like the language itself, one way or another, needs to be revisited and standardized in and of itself. There are certain ways and certain implementations that can kind of big, a certain a mindset when it comes to writing an expression or reflecting an expression in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so types, routines within these types, we could start with these and we could basically go and say, okay, if you're gonna use this particular, because this way we can easily answer the question about using exception, which is an external library. It's no longer an external library. It's more like, now it's a SFAL native type, right? And that will play a role. It'll be just as good as an exception, right? Cool. Um, so that's one thing, so you create that, you're pulling that in. When you're writing your code, you're never interacting with the actual framework. The real question here is, you know, how do you kind of prevent people or ensure that people are not going to access the framework directly? So let me go back in here. Here, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting, right? Because we want to make sure that the people who are building the system or using this system are not going to try to circumvent, SFAL. They're not going to try to go and do something like this, basically, right here. Paul, Vladimir is leaving you a comment saying, hey, don't you get exhausted? I saw you on OpenAI stream and then OData, and you're still here.
Hassan's still here. Mind you, he slept.
Yeah, but I'm not human. We already know that. He's only concerned about your human condition.
Nah, I'm a programmer. There's no such thing as a human and a programmer. You're either one or the other.
You're either one. Um, so here's just a question for you guys. You want to make sure, well, you still want to allow people maybe to access the framework. That's just like a fail-safe policy where you basically go and say, be careful, I don't want you to do that. I want you to rely on only SFAL components. But also at the same time, we don't want people to call system directly. What would be a good idea for that?
For that, you'd have to build your own tool chains, presumably, that can follow standardized rules.
So the structure of the project itself might change, right? Because your project, when you're building a .NET project in general, you're basically looking at, let's take a look here. You're basically going up in here and say, hey, I want to use this format. Watch this. If I go into edit here, watch this. You are already selecting the SDK, right? And that SDK is giving you all these little things that allows you to build. It's basically a template that brings in its own libraries and whatnot. So I think
Yeah.
one thing that we need to think about is building that template, that framework that would allow you to kind of have that kind of setup. So when you're calling things, you're calling things through that SDK directly.
So you're thinking about having like a Microsoft.NET.SDK.the standard
Yeah, or something like standard.core
.SDA. Yeah,
SDK
standard.SDK. Yeah,
or
oh, cool.
standard.sdk.
Yeah,
You can tell it's
yeah,
freaking out because it doesn't know what this is.
yeah. If you did that, then technically you could then expose in the API layer for that only what you want them to interact with. So
Right.
uh,
So one requirement that we would have then is, how do we create something like that? Like, how do you go and create something that basically says, I want to be the official SDK for this framework, and you're building on top of that from now onwards, right? So I'm gonna take a screenshot here, and I'm gonna go and say, okay, we want to replace this, in your SDK project with something that is, this is a free thinking form, right? I want people to kind of, think as loud as you can, because this is literally the idea of, having these discussions, is to be able to, and that basically answers the third question, which is, what's the third thing that we need to care about? Another requirement is to be able to create the SDK for the standard, which should provide all these types and routines, right? So I'm pasting that in here. So Krista, this is how far we went. I was like,
Yeah.
okay, you're creating a new project.
So one thought, San, on that is that we should not be too restrictive. If we're restrictive, we're going to kill adoption on the framework, because if you see the excitement on people on new releases of .NET and all that, if you don't expose that framework, or your framework can't keep up with that momentum, then your framework is going to lose adoption over time.
Right. I guess, that's right. That's correct. I'm still giving people access, to the core framework, the native framework, right? That's the provider, right? There's no way around that. That's your fail safe, because otherwise we'll be sitting here for years, just trying to, catch up to the framework changes and whatnot. But additionally, I want to make sure that the classification of types. People are right. Florian asked me this question before. I said, you're not allowing external libraries to go into your core business logic, but you're still using exception. An exception is going right into your validation, which is the core of your business logic. But if we make exception a part of the framework and redefine that term itself, now we don't have that problem anymore, because you're basically saying external and native components from a domain, a domain application perspective. These two things are actually mainly targeting standard compliant implementation, SFAL on the external side and SFAL on the native side. Okay, which brings us back to kind of this idea. I don't know how these, honestly, I don't know how these SDKs are created. So, Christo, do you want to take kind of the luxury, just as a homework, to kind of look how these are created in the first place?
Yeah, I can try.
Yeah. Ideally, we would fork out of these and start building our own models on top and kind of start abstracting away. So I'll just go down here into actionable items. So Christo CJ there. We'll take a look at how these SDKs are created and how we can modify them. Yeah, probably, Ahmed, that's probably what we're gonna do. So that's one. And then Paul, we need a list. We need a list of all the types, so I don't know if you're here, Paul. I'll just type Paul in here.
Tech.
Huh? Wardy, right?
Yeah, be at TEH should be in there somewhere.
Like this? That's okay.
Yeah.
We'll take a look at the most common types and routines. Routines usually come from types, so there's that. Right, and I will personally kind of, I will try this myself. We'll try this too, and we'll gather some as well. We'll gather
I think,
some as well.
wouldn't it make more sense to start smaller, right?
Yeah.
So, like, build a framework for building web applications. So abstract ASP.NET or something
I
instead
want
of.
to I want to start with the libraries because it's much smaller than ASP.NET.
Right.
The reason why for that is that because we have products that are living, breathing out there, right? That are libraries that people can actually use today. And if these libraries implement SPAL and SFAL, we should be good.
Yeah.
Unless the library itself is the provider, like in the OpenAI situation. Like in the OpenAI situation, the provider is the library itself.
Hmm.
So we can't do anything with that. Okay? So there's
Yeah.
oh, it did find you. Look, I can find you here.
Yeah, I'm there.
So this here is the idea, right? This will make things a lot simpler for us because there are types that are just like, for instance, let me tell you this. This is gonna make a lot of people really happy because there are some of these validations like with the strings, for instance. Let me just show you an example. With strings, you're saying ensure is not null or empty, right? Let me show you a real example, a real life example of what's going on here. Here's this guy here. Here, take a look at this. So you guys can see my, let me mistake this here. Okay, so here's the C# interactive. You can see this screen okay, right? The C#
Yeah.
interactive screen? Good, good. So let me minimize this and let's bring this up a little bit. Let me show you something crazy, right? So let's say you have a string X, right? And this X string is like this, right? If you say string is null or empty for X, it'll say true, right? If you say string is null or white space, it also tells you true. You see the problem here, right? If I make X a white space like this, and I repeat that exact same process, this will come back as false, and this will come back as true. So it seems to me, that is null or white space also includes empty, which is fundamentally not true. Like a white space and an empty string are not the same thing, are they? So these tiny little things in the implementation itself is kind of problematic, right? And we need to have, like, imagine if you have something like class, let's just do this, a standard string like this, and this guy inherits from string, right? And this guy has a function to override, let's see here. What is this guy complaining about first? String cannot derive from even even this string is sealed. You can't even kind of add on top of it, right? But in an ideal world, however we're gonna pull this functionality in, we would want to go here and say, public boolean is null, empty, or white space. And you're passing in your input in here, and then you're doing whatever you want, with this. This is the difference. These little things that you see that don't make sense, in the existing implementation. That's just a tiny, tiny example, right? But there's a lot bigger and a lot more problematic things when it comes to the framework itself.
Hmm. Would it not make sense to contribute this feedback back into the core.NET framework?
Mm-hmm. Right, but it's not standardized. Like the framework itself, if you want to standardize that whole framework, it's going to take you years. You can roll out something today that's standard compliant, that's test driven, that abstracts away. It treats the framework itself as a broker. It puts it in a broker level, and it basically goes and says, here's every other implementation that comes out of that. Paul is busy playing a game.
Oh, I'm listening. I'm just thinking.
Stay with me, son. What do you think, Christo?
Yeah, I know it's going to be. I think it's going to be a hard task to get that adoption to SFAL.
Right.
Because if we call something S string and people's used to normal C# and stuff, now they're working with different data types. And if the behavior change on methods like this is null, empty, or white space, and you almost need to know what's the difference then between what you implement in your framework and your C# knowledge.
Absolutely. It's a massive change, but it kind of creates out, this it creates out this layer where you can actually redefine the core models that you're working with, in a way that actually matches the same principles and tools that you're working with.
Yeah.
By the way, it doesn't have to be S string. It can be just still string, but it's a type that lives in a different namespace.
Yeah.
So, just to kind of give people the idea, the what we'd want to do is to kind of see how do you create that SDK? How do you create that framework? Right? How do we create that framework? Christo, take a look at that. And then Paul, what are the most common used types? Let's just pick up one library. Let's pick up a library like RESTful Sense, for instance. What is all the common used types that are native types? When I say native, meaning framework types. What are the types that we've used across that entire solution? And just list them. Just put a list of them. Not the types that we created, the types that the framework itself provides.
Yeah, I think exception could also be a good candidate because we use the exception handling everywhere.
Oh, exception is definitely a perfect exception would be a part of the implementation of SFAL itself. Like because we don't want to pull an exception library anymore. We just want to pull the framework.
Yeah.
Right?
Jeez. Big task.
Let's give it a shot. So our next discussion, let's see if we can pull in our own framework. So something in here that ideally that the success of this, the measure of success is to be able to go here and say, standard.net.sdk. Because there will be standard Java.sdk and standard Python and whatever else is out there that, whatever the framework is called for these libraries. Right? Can we actually create our own thing like this? And what does that mean? I think it shouldn't be too hard, but I'm going to dig into it as well and see how it works.
Yeah, I think SDKs, Much like when a new version of .NET comes out, you go and you download that framework and it gets installed, and then Visual Studio can kind of recognize it. What it installs and where it installs it, no idea.
That's what we need to understand.
Yeah,
That's what we need to figure out.
I'm sure it's something simple though, right? There's like a known
It should
folder
be.
location that it goes to or something.
It should be.
It's probably the new age equivalent of a global assembly cache.
Right. Like if I go here and say how to create here, I'm pretty sure there's something out there. So if I go here and say how to create a project SDK for .NET, look, this is the Microsoft.NET SDK, right? These are the available SDKs, right? If you look at the actual code, the code is right here, right? So these are the SDKs, and then inside of these, you'll see all the crazy stuff, right? All the tasks, all the unit tests, everything else that comes underneath that. We need to know how that works. If we can just create like a tiny framework that we can pull in and see what that does, that will give us, if you guys notice, I'm expanding our knowledge here. This is beyond just writing some code in a project. You're actually understanding the underlying layer or framework or infrastructure that actually powers that, right?
By abstracting it away, are we not just putting another layer between the standard user's code and the .NET framework?
Pretty much. You're basically saying, hey, standard users, domain system developers, you don't have to deal with non-standardized framework anymore. We built that layer of abstraction that's standardized, that pushes away the non-standardized framework and allows you only to interact with a standardized version.
Right. So that's just going to add a layer of overhead into the application. So the biggest complaint I can see is, oh, it's just going to slow things down, right?
Well, you're gonna have to prove it.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I get
Here.
the value of it, right? Because having a good, clean API that's well understood, well tested, etc., something you have the source code for. I mean, this is part of the reason why .NET is open source, right?
Yeah.
Is because people have cried out for it so much that Microsoft have gone, okay, fine, we'll open source it. But it's one of these things where, like, I do wonder if convincing people that this is a good idea, what we're doing, is going to be the hardest battle here, right? Because not everybody, I'm going to say not everybody, but most developers don't give a crap about quality, right? In the way that perhaps you or I would, in terms of how code looks, right?
That's the thing. I'm not trying to sell anything to anyone. I'm trying to write some high quality, world-class software. And then I show people my code and my theory, right? And then people get to determine, how do I want that level, of quality, right? Do I actually have the need to do something like that? Because eventually, at some point in time, when your software starts breaking and it becomes harder to maintain, you're going to have to raise the question, where do I go to build high quality software? Okay?
Yeah, I think what was resonating with me is like when you talk about concepts and principles are more important than tooling, and it feels to me that what we're building here is tooling, and it's not gonna last in the same way that the standard itself, in terms of the principles that we are trying to promote. I don't know.
I mean, concepts without tools don't exist. They're just ideas. Patterns without tools don't exist, right? They're just ideas.
Yeah. It is a difficult one. I can just see the sort of uphill battle of trying to drive adoption. But I guess the end game here is that if you get to a point where pretty much everything that somebody is writing on top of the standard framework is abstracted away, then there's no reason why we need .NET anymore.
There will be a point in time where we have to go and say, hey, this framework that we abstracted away, just toss it out and build your own implementations underneath.
Yeah.
But that's just a thing that I'm not even interested. Like today we're saying SPAL, standardized provider abstraction. Okay, you built the entity framework, you built Dapper, you built whatever is out there. That's great, right? But I still want you, but you still want to interact with it and not have to change too much when the configuration change. Like the idea here is to change the underlying infrastructure from underneath without the engineers having to do any work at all. Like an S string or a standard string is a standard string, whether it's going through a C++ implementation or modern .NET C# implementation. It doesn't matter what it is. You're still working with string that comes from the standard library.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so
So,
go ahead, Chris.
so I think we are pretty much years away from getting to that point. So I think as a starting point, we can almost think of we've already identified exception handling and inception as one thing. So we can say at the moment in time, SFAL will live side by side with the .NET framework on top of the .NET framework. So you can still access all of that, but in in the early stages, we provide the exception handling for you. We can maybe bring in those other things like security, rollback, logging. All that can be abstracted, and that's your, I can almost say, our five starting points. So we're not really touching on data, um, strings and stuff like that yet. We create a unified way of operating, of how we operate in some ways, and then we can build on that. I think that will be a easier adoption than trying to change data types in the beginning. Give some benefits in terms of this exception handling, rollback, security. Make that the framework, and then we can expand on that. I think if we start too low, trying to change strings and stuff, people won't see the benefit up front. Where I think if we start with workable concepts, then we might sell it better or get more wider adoption to the framework, because we can see the usefulness for that more immediately.
There's a question in the channel. Nabil says, Hassan, is there a matrix to quantify code quality? Either one of you. You want to take a jab at that, and then I'll say my own 2 cents. This is a great question, by the way.
It's a difficult one. I've often wondered if a good place to start would be in something like code analyzers that we could pull into our projects.
Right.
But there's this issue with the standard is guided by this no toasters principle, right? So when we talk about quality, we're talking about fundamentally, has the code been written in accordance with the principles? And it's not something so much that you can automate because of the way that the standard is documented. So it's hard to really quantify in that respect, I would say.
I would personally go ahead, Kirsten. Go ahead.
I think code quality for me is also almost starting basic things like methods shouldn't be too big. Your code should be self-documenting. There should not be reasons to put in code comments. And I think another thing for me is your code shouldn't be so complex that you have to sit and figure out for an hour what you actually did there the previous time. So anybody must come to that code block, be easily spot and see what's going on there. Give it to a junior or anybody, and they can run with it.
Right.
If it's too complex, then it's sometimes easier rewriting the code.
Yep. It's sometimes a lot cheaper. And I think in the standard itself, we kind of touched on that, but I think this is worthy to be a topic of research in and of itself, because in the standard, there are some principles. Let's go back here to the principles. We basically say, it's people first. So we want people to be the priority, not the tools. So I don't care if your tool is fast, but it's hard to understand, it's harming the people are not able to maintain it. It needs to be simple, right? So you can't have excessive inheritance, you can't have entanglements. all these little rules, that we have. We need autonomous components. Components are a kind of independent. We need no magic. Don't try to do some smart things underneath that is hard for someone to kind of grasp. Your software needs to be rewritable. A good high quality software is rewritable. It's easy to kind of pick up and go and say, hey, I'm going to rewrite this component. Like if I tell Paul today, go to one of these OpenAI or OData projects and rewrite some foundation service, he knows exactly what to do and where to go, right? Can you say the same about your typical legacy project? Probably not, right? We talk about mono micro, right? We build monolithic services with the microservices mindset, right? Level zero, it needs to always be understandable. There's the measures of the standard itself, because it's not toaster based, it's human based. We basically, if you want to know the quality of your code, bring out someone that just graduated and put them in front of your code and see how much they can grasp out of it with the little to no experience or knowledge they have. And then based on that, you can actually determine. See, it's people based. Like there is no tool out there that you can write that tells you this code is simple or not. It's the people that have to tell you whether your code is actually simple or not, right? And in order for you to find out that, here's a bunch of principles that we have had. And if you implement these principles and if you apply these principles in your code, right? If I bring an intern or someone who's just started in the tech industry and I was just doing this yesterday with an intern. I was saying, here's the tri nature of everything. What do you think? And the face expressions and the way they take onto the theory and the way they go and research about that theory, that tells you exactly whether you're able to communicate this or not. And just so you know, a lot of people learn differently. Some people learn by writing code, some people learn by watching other people write code, some people learn by reading books, and some people learn by chaos. What that basically means is that they just punch in the dark. They just try different things until they kind of learn something out of it. It's a little bit of a hard way to learn, but that's how some people learn. Right? Most of us, there you go. Well, Paul just pointing out himself, you know,
I
a lot
learned
of people.
everything the hard way. It's not good. Don't
Yeah.
recommend it, guys. 0 out of 10.
That's one way. Like even before the internet and before, you would be the only kid in the street that actually knows how to play with computers and the only kid who has a computer, and the only way for you to be able to learn anything is just punch in the dark. That's your only way, that you will get, to learn something or make it do something interesting, right? Airplane mode, can I run your system without being connected to the internet? No toasters. Do I need to know about some thing that generates, code or something for me without me knowing how it works or that, and then passing it forward. If your code, the standard in general is really relying on people talking to people, right? When it comes to the business side of things, business don't care. Business will say as long as the application is out there, I don't care how it got there. We actually care about how it got there because how it got there can kind of guarantee longevity, maintainability of the systems that you're building, right? What's the point? Okay, let's say Paul, Christo, and I are working on a project, and I'm leading the project, and Christo and Paul just hate themselves. Crazy deadlines. The code is so complicated, but they got it out. Do you think these guys are gonna work with you on the next project? Heck no. No, they're gonna use your internet to submit their resumes to find another job, right? On your laptop, on your own network, right? So you want to maintain that kind of joyful experience for the engineers. It needs to be simple and easy so you can invite people into your industry, and all that kind of good stuff. Someone left a comment here, said, Hassan, what are your thoughts on GPT-4 and SWE jobs? If you're doing grunt work like moving data around, you really should start doing some, research on AI because the next generation of engineers or the post GPT are going to be software engineers who know how to employ GPT to expedite their development process. It's never going to do everything for you. One thing that I know AI is never going to be able to do is inspiration. It's only working with the data that it already has, right? But is that the only source of data that we as humans get? Nope. Sometimes you wake up in the morning and this thing pops, in your mind, something that just tells you, hey, you're supposed to be doing this one thing or another, right? I'll say it to you in a different way. Creating cars or electricity or airplanes, if you put all the data in the world before creating these inventions into a chat GPT today, it will not be able to come up with an idea like flying airplanes or running cars or something like that. It'll just work with what it already has. So it seems like we as human beings have another source of knowledge that comes from above that inspires us to come up with new ideas and new patterns. Okay, if Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or any of these, David or any of these folks are here, yeah, ChatGPT will try to generate based on their previous input, but they will just come up and do something completely different, right? And that's the thing that AI cannot replace, as far as I understand it. Okay, peeps, we have homework. We have things to play around with. Dig into that. And for our next session, we have standard discussions every Monday and Thursday, something like that.
Tuesdays and Thursdays, yeah.
Tuesdays and Thursdays. And for the people who never heard about any of that or never heard about any of the things that we just talked about, go to tinyurl, the standard calendar. I'm going to post that here in the chat, and you'll be able to see our calendar. All of these things are sessions that we plan for, and you can join up ahead. Okay, friends? Cool, cool. We good? All right. I appreciate you all. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you all soon. Take care. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.